Good evening. Tonight is a Tuesday night, so we have a few Dhamma questions have come in to answer, and we'll try and do that. So the first question, Luang Por, are there still noble ones living in the world? Well, this term noble ones is translation from the Pali, Arya Pugala, and as we just chanted in the evening chanting, it refers to the enlightened Sangha. That's monks, nuns, or laymen, laywomen, and there's 4 kinds of noble ones: stream winners, once returners, non-returners, and enlightened, fully enlightened beings, or arahants. Strictly speaking, it's really the duty or the knowledge of a Buddha, an enlightened Buddha, to know other people who's enlightened, who's not. It's one of the great skills of a Buddha. He knows how well the spiritual faculties of each person he encounters, how well they're developed. So how close they are maybe to becoming enlightened, realizing Nibbana, how suitable they are for receiving teachings, what kind of teachings are suitable for each person. So that's a Buddha. One of the first questions I had when I was began studying, practicing Buddhism, they say the life of the Buddha, after his enlightenment, he was sitting under the Bodhi tree in India, enjoying the peace of liberation, the experience of enlightenment, awakening. And at first he thought the Dhamma, the truth that he had realized, is very profound, deep, difficult for an ordinary person to understand or penetrate. So he was considering not teaching. But then the story says the deity Brahma Sahampati, who had a karmic connection with the Buddha from the past, came down from the heaven realm and invited him to teach for the benefit of all beings. So my question was, well, how did Brahma Sahampati know the Buddha was the Buddha? How did the Brahma Sahampati know the Buddha was enlightened? If only a Buddha can know, then how come a deity can know? And there are other instances in the Buddhist texts and commentaries that a deity, and maybe the devas know that a certain monk or nun has become enlightened or attained one part of the path. How do they know? They're not Buddhas. So maybe there are other ways that we can know who is enlightened, who is a noble one. And the obvious one is through hearing somebody recount their experience of practicing the Dhamma, the way their mind has developed through the practice of Sila, Samadhi, Panya, the way they have gained insight into the Four Noble Truths, how they've freed their mind from craving and attachment, which are the causes of suffering, freed their mind from greed, anger and delusion. They might be able to explain how they've done it, and some teachers are very good at this, such as Luang Por Chah. People gain great faith in Luang Por Chah as an enlightened arahant, noble one, because the way he explained the Dhamma, partly through sharing personal experience, and then just his deep insight was revealed through his teachings, and also when people lived with him there was a certain amount of unspoken transmission of the Dhamma. When you live with someone whose mind is pure and free from greed, anger and delusion, you feel it, you sense it on many levels. It's not just their words, partly it's their behavior, partly it's the whole feeling atmosphere around them. There's many aspects to it. Luang Por Chah would be the first one to say, well, don't jump to conclusions as far as believing someone is a noble one. So just on the words of others, reputation. Doesn't mean to say you ignore reputation or the words of others, but don't give it 100% of your belief, maybe 99%, and keep a little space in your mind that maybe this person who is reputed to be a noble one perhaps isn't. Perhaps his students, a teacher may be considered an enlightened one, and then his students talk about that, and they may build a teacher up or overestimate them. Or maybe a practitioner themselves may overestimate their experience, their understanding of Dhamma. It's possible. So you keep a little bit of space in your mind, but particularly fellow practitioners, and particularly Sangha, who live a very, maybe a life devoted to the practice of Dhamma, Vinaya, they're the best ones to judge who is a noble one. And so in the circle of practice monks, say the ones I know in Thailand and around the world nowadays as well, then you often get to know somebody has practiced well, gone far in their practice, had deep insight, and maybe different sources, different monks who are experienced in the practice confer, and then you maybe get a conclusion that such and such a monk is enlightened. That becomes their reputation. But you should still just keep a little bit of space in your mind, perhaps, that maybe it's true, maybe not. But that's how we find out who the noble ones are, as far as we can, through reputation, through the opinion of fellow practitioners who also understand the path, the fruit, and so they're in a good position maybe to comment on another practitioner. So we used to say, it takes one to know one. So if one monk has had their own awakening and reached Nibbana, well, they may know another person who has had the same experience because they have the same level of understanding. So like Luang Por Chah, we believed, was a noble one, an arahant. And then there were other monks who seemed to be noble ones, such as Luang Ta Mahabua. And occasionally, some monks are more outspoken than others. So a monk like Luang Ta Mahabua, sometimes he would say, another monk is a noble one, a stream enterer or an arahant perhaps. And there's a few monks who are more outspoken and say these things, others are more reserved. So Luang Por Chah was pretty reserved and never really said who was a noble one or not, but some teachers did. Luang Por Man did talk about this, and Ajahn Mahabua sometimes, and a few other monks. So just a few days ago, a monk passed away called Luang Por Sang, who was considered an arahant, a noble one. And in the circle of forest monks, that was the general consensus. A very wise, peaceful monk. And I know a monk who once asked him, Luang Por, how far have you gone in your practice? Are you fully awakened? Are you an arahant? And he said, I won't be born again. Which is one way you could say, if somebody has reached Nibbana, they're not going to be born again. It's the purpose of it all. That's why we practice, to reach the deathless, go outside the whole cycle of samsara, birth and death. because wherever there's birth, that has to be followed by aging, sickness and death and all the suffering that life can bring. So if someone goes beyond birth, they're not going to be born again, then they're away from suffering, they're no longer going to have to be experiencing suffering. So he once said that, for example. And we believe there are still enlightened monks in the world in this day and age, although they're very few and far between. But they're still there, and that's a very important thing for the world, because not only is it great good fortune to meet them, hear the Dhamma from them, make merit with them, make offerings to support them, but it also, each enlightened disciple of the Buddha confirms that this path works. It can lead human being from a state of unenlightenment to a state of enlightenment or awakening. That it's not just a myth, it's not just something for the textbooks or something for the ancient times. In this day and age, people can still practice and understand the truth, the Four Noble Truths and the Dhamma and the Vinaya that the Buddha taught. So my answer would be yes, there are noble ones, but don't rush to believe anyone is a noble one. Just take your time to get to know a teacher, listen to what they have to say, and if it matches with what the Buddha says and what other wise teachers say, well, that's a good start, isn't it? Of course, as I mentioned, sometimes people misattribute the characteristics of enlightenment or awakening to some teachers, some self-proclaimed arahants. Ajahn Chah once said, there's a lot of self-proclaimed enlightened beings in the world, and they often don't last that long, and they end up getting married and having kids. Maybe there's a lesson in that. So don't rush to believe everyone is enlightened. Next question. Why is the experience of piti, which means rapture, joy, different for the noble ones compared with the unenlightened person? So piti is it's a spiritual quality. It's a form of happiness. It's translated as rapture, zeal, interest. So it's one of the factors of samadhi. When you practice meditation, as your mind unifies, becomes more peaceful and lets go of the 5 hindrances, piti or rapture arises. But the difference between an unenlightened person and a noble one, is, well, a noble one has no more greed, anger and delusion, or very little greed, anger and delusion, and they have very deep insight into impermanence, unsatisfactoriness and not self, the 3 characteristics of existence. They're seeing them, at least on one level, all the time, and an arahant, all the time. So when a noble one experiences rapture, they don't attach to it. There's no greed, no attachment there. It doesn't stimulate desire. So it's a very pure kind of rapture or joy. Sometimes what we call the joy of Dhamma. So even the Buddha would say meditate sometimes, just for the joy of meditation, for purifying his body and mind, enjoying the peace, the rapture of meditation. And piti has a very refreshing quality about it, so it can be quite good for our physical health as well as our mental well-being. And so the Buddha himself would enter samadhi. And he's a Buddha, he's already enlightened, he's no longer practicing for enlightenment or practicing to see the Dhamma and free himself from mental defilements. He's already done that, but still he would engage in meditation and practices that would bring up joy. Sometimes enlightened beings discuss the Dhamma. Even though they're already enlightened, they don't need to learn the Dhamma or find out anything else, but they discuss the Dhamma for the joy of Dhamma, and it gives rise to rapture. But the thing is, they don't attach to their rapture as self, or they don't crave it, whereas the unenlightened being does, because they still have greed, anger, delusion conditioning their mind. As they're on their path, they may also attach to some of the fruits of their practice. It's just one of those things you have to keep reflecting on, even the good qualities and good experiences that arise from your Dhamma practice. Reflect on them, see them as impermanent, as not self. So the unenlightened person can also experience piti, rapture, maybe from hearing Dhamma, or chanting, or meditating, or offering dana, helping somebody, practicing kindness, compassion. There's many ways rapture arises. And even in more worldly ways, like, I used to experience rapture when my team won the match or scored a goal. When you're watching sport, it can be rapturous. But obviously that rapture is different than the rapture of a noble one, because it's still rooted in worldly dhammas, we say. It can be the subject for greed, attachment, delusion. It can delude you. So certain things may give rise to rapture in your life, but if the insight into impermanence, not self, is not established, well, it may actually lead to more attachment, more delusion, even though it in itself is a form of happiness and joy. So, you crave that rapturous feeling, and it's physical and mental thing, so you crave it. You want more of it, you want to repeat it. So it can even have a certain sensual side to it. It can come with, say, music, sport, entertainment. All kinds of different sensual experiences can give rise to a certain level of rapture, but it tends to be not as profound and deep as that comes, say, from samadhi or from insight into the Dhamma, and it can still be a basis for greed and attachment, so it's limited. So as one of our practices, we have to keep reflecting. Like the Buddha always said, when you develop samadhi, you may become more peaceful, calm, rapturous than before, but you also have to reflect back on the factors of samadhi and see they're impermanent and not self. Another question. How engaged in solving society's problems should Buddhists be? How indeed? How much is enough? How much is the right amount? I'm not sure there's one answer here. Different people have different characters, skills, knowledge, ability, strength. We're different. Some people are physically strong, others are not. Some are mentally apt and others not. Some have great communication skills, others less. So it's obviously a part of our Dhamma practice, whether you're Theravada Buddhist or Mahayana Buddhist, whether you practice a lot of compassion or less, whether you're very secluded, introverted meditator, or you're going out into the world a lot. It's something you have to consider, isn't it? It's part of the practice, but you have to learn what is supportive, what you can manage as an individual, as you're practicing the Buddhist path, the Noble Eightfold Path. So from my experience, every practitioner, Sangha member or layperson will have some level of engagement with society, with the world, in terms of helping, practicing compassion, sharing the Dhamma, teaching the Dhamma, giving materials, help and support, organising things, advocating for change in society. You know, everyone does something, I think, but it depends on the person and their situation, who they are. You know, sometimes you may say quite a common model is, you know, Dhamma practitioners in their early years are quite limited because they're learning the Dhamma for themselves and learning to meditate, learning to keep precepts. They might practice or engage with the world around them on a more limited level in the beginning, until they're more experienced, more confident in the practice, and later on maybe they teach or they share their knowledge, or they offer, they give something back to society in a much more concrete and more energetic way maybe later on. That's quite a common sort of pattern. But then there's those who are, you know, from day one, they love to be engaged with the world and they follow the Buddhist path, maybe have faith in the Buddha, but they're out there doing lots of charity and dana, helping people. Maybe they're particularly involved in certain issues in the world, you know, areas of injustice or problems that they've recognised or have some understanding of, and they're really pushing for helping to solve that problem, you know, poverty, sickness, social injustice. And, you know, some people do a lot more, and they've already been doing that from day one. That's in their character. Perhaps you might call them more the Bodhisattva type, or certainly Mahayana Buddhists are very familiar with social action, helping. I once been to Taiwan before, where the Buddhists there, the Mahayana Buddhists, you know, they're doing a lot of social activism, raising funds to help poverty, disaster relief, building hospitals and things. Very engaged. Theravada Buddhists is a sort of mixture across the spectrum from what I can see. You know, there are those who are very kind of quiet, solitary meditators and do a lot of study and do a lot of meditation, but don't have a lot of interaction with the world, maybe quite minimal. But then there's others who do more. As I said, the sort of traditional model often is you start off small, and then as your abilities and skills and knowledge improve and your own practice develops, well, maybe you can do more over time. So again, talking about teachers such as someone like Ajahn Mahabua, who a forest monk who in his early years was very quiet, secluded, reclusive, taught his own monks, his own disciples, but didn't go out teaching much outside the monastery and didn't have an awful lot to do with society, very kind of quiet. But then in his later years, complete opposite, complete transformation, and he was, you know, fundraising for so many different projects and charities and going out, giving food and clothing and blankets to the poor and building hospitals and even building dogs' homes and building prisons and clinics and supporting all kinds of good causes, as well as teaching the Dhamma, and became hugely popular in his later life. You know, that you just can't always tell, and you sometimes people suddenly they take off and are doing a lot more. Perhaps what's less common is people who are very engaged to start with and later on stop. Occasionally it happens because they get burnt out and they sort of reduce their activities, but generally once somebody is more engaged with society and the world, helping people in different ways, they tend to keep going and maybe do more, or at least just keep up the level that they're at. So partly it's a character thing. Especially nowadays, you could say there's more means to help the world in a way because of technology, communication, IT. Maybe there's more means for us to help each other, and so there are a lot of different ways Buddhists engage with the world to do with the environment. And you know, the core teachings of the Buddha can be applied to all the modern day problems about, bringing compassion into the way we treat each other on an individual basis, and then on the level of governments, the world. So Buddhists can push for non-violent conflict resolution rather than fighting wars, push for preservation of the environment. So the Buddha encouraged us not to cut the forests down. The Buddha said, don't cut the trees of the world down because they're a very useful resource for the world. He'd say, cut the forest of your kilesas down, in your mind. So turn your attention inwards rather than plundering the resources of the world. And of course this is much more relevant now as human beings increase in number. We have to look after the environment more, be more sensitive, more careful. The Buddha encouraged leaders and governments to be just, be fair, not to exploit the population, not to go and start wars unnecessarily and so on. There's lots of good teachings the Buddha gave for governments, leaders, whether it's on a small scale or on a bigger scale. So there's plenty of scope for introducing the Buddhist teachings into daily life in different areas, education, administration, government, even Buddhist economics. There's teachings the Buddha gave on how to earn your living, and then how to interact with others in the way you do commerce, trade and so on, based around ethical conduct and so on. So there's plenty of scope for engaging with the world using Buddhist teachings, but how much each individual does, you have to monitor yourself. So one very good way of doing that is to say, well, what are the results of what you're doing? If you're engaged with the world, helping people, doing this, doing that, what are the results? Are your own personal mental defilements increasing or reducing as you do this? Because sometimes people get very angry as they go out to help the world, and their anger increases. Or some people lose their way and they sort of start exploiting others, maybe unwittingly, unconsciously, or sometimes deliberately. They're in positions where they're helping people, but then they can exploit the people they help and so on. So you want to look at that side of it. You keep your personal practice going as you engage with the world, so that you're not increasing your greed, anger and delusion, or increasing the greed, anger and delusion of others. And that's something that we have to keep looking at over and over again. I don't think it's a one-off thing, is it? You keep looking and learning as you practice, as you engage with the world. So there's just a few reflections on that issue. The last question tonight. The Buddha taught us to practice for Nibbana, the end of suffering, or the end of rebirth. Why didn't he talk about the origins of birth or the origins of the world? Well, in one way, I think he did talk about the origin of the world. It's just not in the way most people think. Like, everyone likes to ask the question, who created the world? How was the world created? When was it created? What led to the beginning, the Big Bang and all of that? And the Buddha used to talk more in practical terms of your world as a human being living right now, right here. If you're still subject to stress and suffering, how do you end that right here, right now, in this very lifetime? He would say this is the more important question to ask, rather than sort of researching back into prehistoric history to try and find the origins of the world. And you could spend your whole life doing that, and people do, and they neglect their own personal suffering, and they don't practice much in terms of removing their own mental defilements and their own ignorance. So the Buddha was very practical and direct, encouraging us or directing us to do that. And he said, we create the world every moment through our desires and our attachments. So the origin of the world is right here. When you fall into craving, clinging, that is the world forming. So your eyes, you have eyes, and as you see, if this gives rise to craving, that's the very world forming right there, because you have ignorance conditioning the mind. So this was his approach, to observe more in the present life and the present moment how the world forms. And the result of the Buddhist path, the Noble Eightfold Path, when developed, is Nibbana, which is called the deathless ending, means the end of birth, or the unborn, the uncreated. And I think you'll notice as you practice, particularly as you practice meditation, samatha and vipassana meditation, you become more and more aware of the ending of things, because that is the actual way of the world. Everything that we cling to and desire ends. So, pleasure ends, pain ends, feelings arise, pass away, thoughts arise and pass away. And the more you practice, the more you notice the passing away or the cessation of experience. And so the final cessation is Nibbana. Whereas the beginning of things is associated with more suffering, isn't it? Birth leads to more suffering. The next thought that you get lost in leads to suffering. The next moment of desire is leading on to attachment and suffering. So actually we've been kind of caught up in the beginning of things, the beginning of the world, the beginning of desire and attachment, over and over again, ad infinitum, indefinitely. The Buddha said he looked back to the origin of the world. He said it's so far back, it's just not worth doing this. It's not a worthy pursuit. He was looking back for the origin of suffering, the origin of the world, and he said that ignorance, avijja, is the origin, and there's no real start to that. Because where does ignorance come from? Well, it comes from craving and attachment. When our mind follows craving and attachment, the mental defilements, that conditions more ignorance. So it's circular. So it's just like a non-question really, to go back and find the origin of everything, because you're just going back and looking at a point on a circle. Whereas Nibbana is outside of the circle, it's the cessation of things. And as you're practicing mindfulness and investigating the three characteristics, you're becoming more and more familiar with the ending or the cessation of experience. And this is what ultimately leads to the cessation of birth, sickness, death, leads to Nibbana. So you might say the Buddha was more interested in getting us to see cessation rather than origins and birth. As the wise man said, I don't fear death, I fear birth. I fear being born again, because that's what follows on from death when you're still affected by ignorance. But the arahant doesn't fear death because they don't fear birth, because they know there's going to be no more birth. So there's no more fear then. So there's a few answers for tonight's questions. If they've been any use to you, that's good. But anyway, I encourage you to keep up your practice, and we can always meet again and discuss the Dhamma again.